Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I recently had a really awesome and fruitful conversation with another Catholic YouTuber. That interview is going to be out soon on his channel, and when it is, I'll make it known on my Twitter and my YouTube channel and so forth. And we talked about the Society of St. Pius X. And it was a great conversation because, first of all, this man is a man of goodwill. It wasn't sort of as some of the conversations about the society go, back and forth with certain parts of canon law. That stuff's important. But sometimes when you're discussing these matters in the church and you're going back and forth with canon this and canon that, let's be honest, you get into the point where basically what you're doing is lawyering, if that makes sense, and you seem more like tax lawyers trying to find loopholes for their clients rather than Catholics trying to figure out what we're supposed to do in a time of crisis to save our souls and so on and so forth. And the hierarchy in the church really tries to avoid the idea that we're in a time of crisis. And that is exactly why we're in a crisis. The analogy I gave on his show was essentially, if we look back to we look back to about the 4th century or so when the Arian crisis was at its peak, it wasn't a crisis because there was heresy. There's always been heresy. There will always be heretics. This is said as much as said, or St. Paul said as much. That's what I'm trying to say. By St. Paul in the Bible. The crisis comes when St. Paul rebukes Peter to his face, and Peter doesn't do anything about it. And the analogy I said was, imagine you're on a ship, and we know that the church is the bark of Peter. It's the boat you get on in order to get across the waters of damnation to find salvation, and you can't get off the ship. Well, when you get on a ship, you recognize that there will be waves, and there will be a storm, and there will be a tempest and hurricanes, and that's all possible. But you expect the captain of the ship and the crew under the captain to do what it takes so that you don't capsize, or so that you don't jump off the edge and go into the ocean. Well, if you're in that tempest or that hurricane or whatever, and the waves are coming nice and high and it looks like the ship is going to capsize, it becomes a crisis when the captain of the crew says, well, we're not really going to do what we've always done to stop you from falling off the ship. It becomes a crisis when, even if the captain wants to do something, that the crew doesn't listen, doesn't actually do what works. And this really, is an example of the times we're living in. On the one hand, you could say that the popes have been, since the Second Vatican Council, aware of the crisis and really done nothing about it. On the other hand, you could say they've been aware and sort of tried to do some things about it, but they don't actually have control of the crew, and the crew doesn't actually do anything to stop the people from leaving the ship. And in fact, we're basically being told that, you should jump off the ship to reason with the sharks. You should jump off the ship to have an encounter with the ocean. Or we should invite the ocean on board and see if we can come to some sort of common understanding. And you see where I'm going with this analogy. The point being is the storm is not the crisis. The reaction to the storm is what gives us the crisis. And that's what we're going through right now in the church. And of course, the hierarchs of the church today, for the most part, will not admit that we're in a crisis, which is, again, what makes the crisis. I'm sure if you were to go back to the early centuries of the church, and you were to find the Arian crisis, the bishops who had accepted, promoted, tolerated, or even embraced Arianism as their own personal theological principles, I'm sure they themselves would have said we were in no crisis. Otherwise, they'd have to admit they were heretics or derelict in their duty. Well, Bishop Schneider, he was recently on a show for I think it's called the Confraternity for Our Lady of Fatima. It's an apostolate that I support, and I suggest everybody watch their monthly live streams with Bishop Schneider. I like to keep up on those myself. They're really good. And this fear that people have about the traditional Latin Mass being canceled by Pope Francis was one of the questions sent in by one of the viewers. And we're just going to watch Bishop Schneider's response to these things. And then we're going to ask ourselves, is this actually how Catholics are supposed to act? And it is. We'll see what he says. And then we're going to look to church history to find that during the Arian crisis, this was what was believed by, or the early church and the Arian crisis. This is what was believed by, the church. This is what was believed as an orthodox position. So, without further ado, let's just take a look here at what Bishop Schneider has to say.
I think that the Pope has not the power to abolish the traditional Mass. Why? Because it is a property, a treasure of the entire Church, from all the saints, the Church of all ages. This Mass is not the Tridentine Mass, at all not, because it's the same Mass. We have texts before the Council of Trent. This is exactly the same order of Mass. There was no changes after the Council in the order of Mass. There was a new missal, but not a new order of Mass. And therefore, because of the very venerable age and constant perennial use of this order of Mass by so many saints and generations of Catholics and of almost all Catholic nations, the Pope has no power to simply abolish this, as the Pope would not have a power, let us say, to abolish the Apostolic Creed and to substitute the Apostolic Creed with a new formula and prohibiting at the same time the use of the Apostolic Creed. The same we can apply to the order of Mass. This is a formula of venerable old use. And a priest can, by good conscience, even if the Pope would prohibit the traditional Mass, to continue to celebrate the Mass, because here he will be obeying to the Holy Mother Church. This is a greater obedience than to do a wrong obedience to an order of a Pope, which evidently is damaging the spiritual good of the Church. We cannot obey. It would be a false obedience to cooperate something which is evidently damaging the spiritual good of the souls and of the entire Church. This Pope is only short. Pope Francis is not eternal. His pontificate is also limited by time, by his own personal limitations. And so we have to look then this issue in the vision, in the eyes of 2,000 years of all the other popes, saints, and so on. And then a priest can celebrate, of course, to my opinion, secretly or clandestinely, in a prudent way, praying for the Pope, of course, loving the Pope, even though he cannot obey him in this concrete case, praying for his bishop, loving his bishop in a supernatural way, and of course be submitted to maybe to another priest in good stance, or another bishop, emeritus bishop, and so on. It would be only a temporal measure, very short, to my opinion. Then the faithful, of course, can fulfill the Sunday obligation by a Mass, celebrated in this way, in a secret Mass. But I repeat, the Pope Francis has to be mentioned, the Bishop of the Diocese has to be mentioned. We have not to make the polemics against the Pope and the Bishop unnecessary, but we have to pray for them, that God may illuminate them, that they can come back, and again they may be treasuring the traditional Mass.
So essentially what Bishop Schneider is saying here is that the Pope doesn't have the power to suppress or abolish or to cancel the traditional Latin Mass. And he says something very important that not a lot of people make this distinction. He says the order of Mass, not the missal. And this is what people have to understand. Bishop Schneider is right in saying that the order of Mass is part of sacred tradition. And he says this is, for example, the same way that you couldn't just get rid of the creed of the Apostles' Creed. You couldn't get rid of that, at least in the way that it's presented. I mean, maybe you could change the wording or something like that. I mean, as long as it expresses the same thing. And he says this because it's a matter of sacred tradition. Now, this is an important and very strong argument. Because if something is a matter of sacred tradition, then the Pope does not have the power to abolish that thing. And again, what we're talking about here is the order of Mass. So what is the order of Mass as compared to the Missal? The order of Mass is the way that the Mass plays out. So it's the formula, as he says. So if you go through your traditional Latin Mass Missal and you see the various parts of the Mass and how they play out, throughout history, we've seen adaptations in how those parts of the order of the formula of Mass have been presented. But the removing of those things, the abrogation of parts of that order, the construction of a new order in place of the old one, this is something that has not been seen because this is not allowed. This is against the sacred tradition. You might even compare it, for example, to the fact that, yes, the Pope has supreme authority, but he can't change the order of the scriptures. He can't alter the canon of the scriptures. I mean, we could put them in a different way in the Bible, I guess. I mean, sometimes there's different ordering of which books might go where here and there. But the contents has to be the same. You can't change it because the scriptures themselves are a part of sacred tradition. They can't be touched. This is why Luther was such a heretic. So yes, does the Pope have the authority to change a missal? Of course. But that missal he cannot thrust that missal upon the faithful and then forbid them from the traditional Mass if this new missal is in contradiction to the order of Mass as it's always been understood in sacred tradition. The Council of Nicaea makes this very clear, for example, when talking about sacred icons. And basically you're anathematized if you reject any part of sacred tradition, which includes icons, which are of a lower liturgical, I would argue they're of a lower liturgical primacy or place of emphasis than the Mass, because, of course, you don't need icons in order to pray. They're helpful, they're wonderful, but they are a part of sacred tradition nonetheless. And he calls this a false obedience. And there's no virtue in obeying something that is unlawful just to say that you're obedient. So you have every right, in his words, to celebrate the Mass clandestinely or attend a clandestine Mass. We're going to look at his next question, and then I want to actually look to something from the early church to further validate what the good bishop says.
Yes, the criteria that this is a wrong obedience towards the bishop. The bishop is here and the Pope abusing their powers for the harm of the church. And so these priests can say, I cannot obey here because if I will obeying, I will cooperating to bring a harm, spiritual harm for the church and the souls. And in this case, the apparent disobedience is basically an obedience to the constant, perpetual sense of the church, of the popes and the saints of the ages.
Okay, that's perfect. So essentially what he's saying here is that if you're a priest, and he doesn't say just your bishop, he says the Pope. If you're a priest and you're going to be told you can't say the traditional Mass anymore, whatever the situation may be, then you have the right to disobey. And he uses words that are very similar to Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. When Lefebvre, I think it was in 1976, I was around there. I think it was in the lead up to the ordinations of the first crop of priests from Écône, if I'm not mistaken. But essentially what he said was, He said, I will not stand before God and be told that I've used my episcopacy to aid in the destruction of the church, meaning he's got a role to play as a shepherd of shepherds, as a bishop. He's part of the apostolic succession. He's not going to use his role in the apostolic succession to harm the church. He's not going to do it. And this was something you'd be called a schismatic for, however many years ago, but this is basically just the basic traditionalist position from a man like Bishop Schneider today, and it's not really controversial for many people. It just shows you how times have changed. But is this true? Because what Bishop Schneider is saying here is basically, you have the right to disobey, and you will know when you ought to disobey. And back to that conversation I had with this other fella in the interview that'll be out in a couple days, we kept going back and forth about, yes, in theory, obviously, great spiritual writers talk about resisting the Pope or that sort of thing. But how could we ever know? Well, I don't have an answer for how you personally would know. But if we actually look into the tradition, we find that this idea that Bishop Schneider has is not some crazy idea. This is essentially just inferred. It is assumed that in a time of crisis, that you, even as a layperson, would have the ability to use your reason and discern when disobedience to positive laws of the church, even the Pope, would be permissible. And I found evidence for this. This is from a selection of works called the Apostolic Constitutions. It's a very ancient collection of works. And we see here, I think this is big enough. Maybe I'll go like this. There you go. This is from Book 2, paragraph 19. This is from around the 4th century. This is right in the time of the Arian crisis when I think this would have been finished being compiled. And it's from a section that says that a shepherd who is careless of his sheep will be condemned, and that a sheep which will not be led by the shepherd is to be punished. Here's what it says. It says, "Hear, O you bishops, and hear, O you of the laity." So not just bishops, but you as a layperson, how God speaks. "I will judge between ram and between sheep and sheep." And he says to the shepherds, "You shall be judged for your unskillfulness and for destroying the sheep. That is, I will judge between one bishop and another, and between one layperson and another, and between one ruler and another. For these sheep and these rams are not irrational, but rational creatures." I'm going to pause there for a second. You're a rational creature. You can make decisions. How do you know that something is not aligned with tradition? You can just read the Baltimore Catechism. It's really simple. You don't have to be some crazy theologian. He continues, "Lest at any time a layperson should say, 'I am a sheep and not a shepherd, and I am not concerned for myself,' meaning, it's not my job to figure it out. I'm just going to, go along. Let the shepherd look to that, for he alone will be required to give an account for me. For as that sheep that will not follow its good shepherd is exposed to the wolves, to its destruction, so that which follows a bad shepherd is also exposed to unavoidable death, since his shepherd will devour him. Wherefore care must be had to avoid destructive shepherds." I'm going to repeat this for a second here. He's saying that just as a sheep that will not follow its good shepherd is exposed to the wolves, that which follows a bad shepherd is also exposed to unavoidable death, since his shepherd will devour him. Wherefore care must be had to avoid destructive shepherds. So to summarize, you have to follow good shepherds, and you can't follow bad shepherds, and you'll be judged for following them. This is not some document from, radtradblogpodcast.com from 2023. This is from the early church. The modernists love to go back to the early church. I don't think they ever actually do, because the early church would condemn them outright. But this is from a perennial work of tradition that's part of the church. It's been used for centuries, if not millennia, by Catholic scholars, theologians. In fact, this reference to this is included in the Catholic Encyclopedia, and it's spoken of highly. It clearly represents the consensus of faith in those first 3 centuries or 4 centuries of the church. It doesn't give us criteria for knowing who the bad shepherd is, other than the fact that we have reason. It's really that simple. God created you with an intellect and a will. You use your intellect to understand things, and you use your will to do things about the things that you understand. If you understand that things are bad, then you don't do bad things. If you understand that things are good, then you do good things. That's it. So if Pope Francis comes down and says, no mass, no Latin mass for you, this is unlawful. And if you choose to disobey, as Bishop Schneider says, whether you're a priest or a bishop or a layperson, then you are obeying a higher authority, which is sacred tradition, which is higher than the Pope in a sense. Again, as we said, the Pope himself is actually subject to it. Just like he can't change the Apostles' Creed, just like he can't change the order of the Mass, which is part of sacred tradition. Not the missal, but the order. And the new Mass, the order is completely destroyed. Just like he can't change the Scriptures. These are part of sacred tradition. The Pope has absolute authority, but does not have arbitrary authority. So take heart, my friends. If the crackdown is coming, you're not some sort of excommunicated schismatic. And as the modernists love to say, you're going to be just like those of the early church. So how about that? As always, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless. Thanks for watching the video. And before you go, I just wanted to talk about one more thing. You've probably heard the expression, buy locally. However, some things you just can't get locally. So if you're going to buy something you can't get locally, you want to try to buy from somebody who shares your values. Well, if you enjoy what we do at this channel, thank you very much, and we share the same values. Well, here at the Kennedy Report, we've actually embarked on a very interesting endeavor. We've procured frankincense oil from the Middle East. Maybe you've bought essential oils before. I know I have. My wife likes them for making remedies and making the house smell nice. Well, the problem is with those companies is that usually they're owned by people who are part of really strange New Age movements or false religions. So by supporting them, you're supporting something that you're not in line with. Well, if you click the link in the description, you can see where we have our sacred frankincense oil, and we also have a lanolin balm for sale. There are numerous reported health benefits for frankincense oil. We're not making a claim one way or the other here at the Kennedy Report. That's not our place. But if you're into these things, you know what I'm talking about. And it should be noted, we actually procured some of the best oil in the world, and we only have 70 of them in stock, and they're going to go quick, and we're not sure if we're going to get them again. So if you like the channel and you can't buy these things locally because you don't happen to live near a frankincense manufacturing location in the Middle East, then at least you can buy them from somebody who has the same values as you. Click the links in the description to find out more, and thank you.